The keys felt heavier in my palm than they should have, cold metal against skin that had grown thin with 73 years of living. I stood in my own driveway, watching my daughter-in-law Christine Slaughter slide into the driver's seat of my silver Camry like she owned it. Like she owned everything in my life. "You're just a useless old woman," she'd said not 5 minutes ago, her manicured fingers already wrapped around my car keys. "You don't even need to drive anymore. What's the point?" The engine turned over with a familiar purr, a sound that had been mine for 8 years, ever since I'd bought the car with my own money, my own carefully saved pension funds. Now Christine was adjusting the mirrors, her blonde hair catching the late afternoon sun streaming through my kitchen window where I still stood, frozen. "Where are you going?" I had asked, my voice smaller than I intended. "Out to celebrate." She hadn't even looked at me. "The promotion's practically guaranteed. Joan Eshu's been hinting all month. Tonight the girls and I are hitting Rosewood. You know, that new place downtown? The one with the rooftop bar? Rosewood. Where a single cocktail cost more than I spent on groceries in a week." I pressed my palm against the cool glass of the window and watched my car disappear down Maple Street, carrying with it another piece of my autonomy. This was how it had been for the past 2 years, ever since my son Richard had convinced me to move in with them. "It makes sense, Mom," he'd said, his voice carrying that patronizing tone that had replaced genuine affection somewhere along the way. "The house is too big for you alone. Christine and I have plenty of space. Plenty of space, but apparently not plenty of respect." The silence in the house felt different now. Not peaceful, but hollow. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking, each second marking time that felt increasingly meaningless. When had I become this person? This woman who stood at windows, watching her own possessions drive away in someone else's hands. I moved through the house like a ghost haunting her own life. In the living room, my few remaining photographs sat clustered on one small end table, the rest of the surfaces dominated by Christine's modern art pieces and Richard's golf trophies. My wedding photo with Harold was there, faded now, his kind eyes looking out at a world he'd left behind 12 years ago. Next to it, a picture of Richard as a boy, gap-toothed and grinning, before life had taught him that his mother was a burden rather than a blessing. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the dinner I'd prepared. Pot roast, Richard's favorite, though he'd barely touched it before rushing off to some client meeting. Christine had picked at her salad and complained about the sodium content. "We're watching our health," she'd said, as if my cooking were an assault on their well-being rather than an act of love. I began washing the dishes by hand, though they had a perfectly good dishwasher. The warm water felt good on my arthritic fingers, the repetitive motion almost meditative. This was my small rebellion, doing things my own way in a house that no longer felt like home. The phone rang as I was drying the last plate. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice was familiar, crisp, professional, unmistakably that of Joan Eshu, the woman who'd been my executive assistant for 15 years before I'd retired. "Hazel? I hope I'm not calling too late." "Joan." I settled into the kitchen chair, surprised by how good it felt to hear her voice. "Not at all. How are you?" "I'm well, thank you." "Listen, I have something rather important to discuss with you. I know it's short notice, but would you be available for lunch tomorrow? There's something I'd like to propose." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Available? When was I not available? My calendar was emptier than a church on Monday morning. "Of course. Where did you have in mind?" "The Riverside Grill. 1 o'clock?" After I hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness of the kitchen, not bothering to turn on the lights. Outside, the neighborhood was settling into its evening routine. Porch lights flickering on, families gathering around dinner tables, the normal rhythms of life continuing as if my world hadn't been slowly dismantling itself, piece by piece. I thought about the woman I used to be, Hazel Delora, maiden name restored in my mind if not legally. The woman who had built Eshu and Associates from a 2-person consulting firm into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. The woman who had navigated boardrooms full of men who thought she was just another secretary, until she showed them otherwise. The woman who had raised Richard as a single mother after Harold died, working 16-hour days to ensure he had every opportunity. Somewhere along the way, that woman had gotten lost. She'd retreated into the background, convinced that her purpose was to make herself smaller so others could be larger. When had I stopped mattering? When had my needs become inconveniences and my presence become a burden? The front door slammed shut around 11:30, followed by the sound of heels clicking unsteadily across the hardwood floor. Christine's laugh was too loud, too bright, the kind of forced joy that comes from trying too hard to have fun. "Did you wait up for me?" Her voice carried that particular brand of condescension reserved for children and the elderly. How sweet. I hadn't waited up. I'd been lying in my bed, the guest room bed, in what used to be my own house, staring at the ceiling and wondering when I'd become a stranger in my own life. "How was your celebration?" I asked from the top of the stairs. "Premature, as it turns out." Even drunk, her voice carried an edge of bitterness. "Joan Eshu called during dinner. The promotion's been put on hold, some corporate restructuring bullshit." I gripped the banister tighter than necessary, processing this information. Joan hadn't mentioned any restructuring during our brief conversation. In fact, she'd sounded almost excited about whatever she wanted to discuss. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure I meant it. "Whatever. These things happen." But her voice cracked slightly, revealing something vulnerable beneath the bravado. "I'm sure it's just temporary. Joan likes me. She's always telling me how valuable I am to the team." I thought about all the times Joan had called me over the years, asking my opinion on personnel decisions, market strategies, the direction of the company. Even in retirement, she'd continued to seek my counsel, though I'd assumed it was just politeness, a way of honoring our long professional relationship. Now I wondered if there was more to tomorrow's lunch than simple nostalgia. As I finally drifted off to sleep, one thought echoed in my mind. Maybe it was time to stop being the woman who watched her life drive away in someone else's hands. Maybe it was time to remember who Hazel Delora really was. The last thing I heard before sleep claimed me was Christine fumbling with the car keys downstairs, probably checking to make sure she hadn't lost them. She had no idea what she was about to lose instead. The morning arrived gray and bitter, matching my mood as I stood in the kitchen making coffee with hands that trembled slightly. Not from age, but from something I couldn't quite name. Anticipation, perhaps, or the first stirrings of something that had been dormant for far too long. Christine hadn't emerged from her bedroom yet, probably nursing the hangover she'd earned with her premature celebration. Richard had left early for a golf meeting, kissing my cheek absently and reminding me to "Take it easy today, Mom," as if I were made of spun glass. The house felt lighter without their presence, though the weight of my circumstances hadn't lifted. I dressed carefully for lunch with Joan, a navy blue dress that had once commanded respect in boardrooms, though it hung a bit looser now than it used to. In the mirror, I could see traces of the woman I'd been. Sharp eyes that had once read market trends and corporate politics with surgical precision. A jawline that had never learned to soften in the face of opposition. But there were new lines now, etched by years of making myself smaller, quieter, less consequential. The taxi ride to Riverside Grill cost $12, money I calculated against my dwindling monthly allowance from Richard, who managed my finances for my own good. Another small humiliation in a life that had become a series of them. When had I allowed my independence to be parceled out to me like charity? Joan was already seated when I arrived, and seeing her was like looking at a version of myself that had refused to fade. At 62, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never learned to apologize for taking up space. Her silver hair was styled impeccably, her suit tailored to perfection, and when she stood to embrace me, I caught a hint of the perfume she'd worn even as my assistant, Chanel No. 5, classic and uncompromising. "Hazel, you look wonderful," she said, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of concern at what she saw. "You're a terrible liar, Joan, but I appreciate the kindness." I settled into the chair across from her, noting how the restaurant's other patrons seemed to defer to her presence. "You, on the other hand, look like you've conquered the world." "Not quite the world," Joan smiled, signaling the waiter with the subtle authority of someone accustomed to excellent service. "But perhaps a significant portion of the consulting industry." We ordered, Joan, a Caesar salad with grilled salmon, Myself, soup, and half a sandwich, mindful of the cost, even though Joan had insisted on paying. Old habits of financial anxiety died hard when you lived on someone else's grudging generosity. "I suppose you're wondering why I called," Joan said after we'd dispensed with the pleasantries about health, weather, and the general decline of modern manners. The thought had crossed my mind. I studied her face, noting the excitement she was trying to contain. "Though I suspect it has something to do with Christine's failed promotion." Joan's eyebrows rose slightly. "Christine mentioned that, did she?" "She mentioned you called during her celebration dinner. Apparently, there's been some corporate restructuring?" "Ah." Joan leaned back in her chair, and for a moment her expression was unreadable. "That's not entirely accurate." I waited, having learned long ago that silence was often more powerful than questions. "The truth is, Hazel, there's been an opportunity. Blackstone Industries wants to acquire Issue and Associates. It's a substantial offer, more than substantial. But they're not interested in purchasing a company. They want to purchase a legacy. Your legacy." The words hit me like cold water. "I don't understand. They want you back. As CEO, they want Hazel Delora to lead the transition, to ensure that the company culture and vision remain intact during the acquisition." Joan leaned forward, her voice dropping to the intimate tone she'd used when we'd planned corporate strategies behind closed doors. "They're offering you complete autonomy, a salary that would make your current situation irrelevant, and the chance to build something even bigger than what we created before." I stared at her, my mind struggling to process what she was saying. "Joan, I'm 73 years old. I've been retired for 5 years. 5 years during which the industry has gone to hell because people like us stepped aside and let people like Christine Slaughter think they could fill our shoes." Joan's voice carried an edge now, the steel that had made her such an effective assistant. "Do you know what her biggest client victory was last year? Convincing a mid-level manufacturing company to switch their payroll software. That was her triumph. Her contribution to the great machinery of commerce." The soup arrived, but I found I had no appetite for it. My hands were shaking again, but this time I knew why. It wasn't fear or frailty. It was the recognition of something I'd thought was dead awakening within me. "They want me to come back," I repeated, tasting the words. "They want you to come home," Joan corrected. "Where you belong. Where you've always belonged." I thought about Christine's words from the night before. "Joan likes me. She's always telling me how valuable I am to the team." The naive confidence, the assumption that her mediocrity was somehow indispensable. "What would happen to Christine?" I asked, though I wasn't sure why I cared. Joan's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "What happens to anyone who's no longer needed? The company would restructure. Redundant positions would be eliminated. It's quite standard in acquisitions." The implications settled over me like a heavy blanket. Christine, who had spent the evening celebrating a promotion that would never come, had no idea that her future, and her attitude toward me, had just been placed entirely in my hands. "I need to think about this," I said, though every cell in my body was already screaming, "Yes." "Of course," Joan signaled for the check. "But don't think too long. The offer expires Friday. Blackstone has other options if we can't reach an agreement." As we waited for her car to arrive, Joan placed a hand on my arm. "Hazel, I need you to understand something. This isn't charity. This isn't some well-meaning attempt to make you feel relevant. They want you because you're the best. Because when you walked away, you left a hole in this industry that no one else has been able to fill. Even at 73? Especially at 73. You've got nothing left to prove and nothing left to lose. That makes you dangerous in the best possible way." The ride home passed in a blur of possibility and calculation. I thought about Christine's manicured fingers on my car keys, her casual cruelty disguised as concern for my welfare. I thought about Richard's patronizing reminders to take it easy, as if my life's work had been some sort of exhausting hobby I'd finally outgrown. But mostly, I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who had built something from nothing, who had earned every dollar and every ounce of respect through sheer will and uncompromising excellence. That woman wouldn't have allowed herself to become invisible. She wouldn't have handed over her car keys to someone who saw her as nothing more than an inconvenient obligation. When I arrived home, Christine was in the kitchen, looking pale and slightly green around the edges. She'd made herself coffee and toast, leaving her dishes in the sink for me to clean. A small but telling assumption about our relative roles in the household. "How was your lunch?" she asked without looking up from her phone. "Enlightening," I said, hanging my purse on the hook by the door. "How are you feeling?" "Like death warmed over." She finally glanced at me, her expression carrying that familiar mix of condescension and mild irritation. "I don't suppose you could keep it down today. My head is killing me." I studied her face. Young, confident, blissfully unaware that her world might be about to shift on its axis. "Of course, dear. I wouldn't want to disturb your recovery." She smiled, the kind of smile you give to a well-behaved pet. "Thanks. Oh, and Joan called this morning. Something about wanting to schedule a follow-up meeting about the restructuring. I told her I'd call back when I felt human again." "I'm sure she'll understand," I said, though I was quite certain she wouldn't. That evening, I sat in the guest room that had become my prison, Joan's business card in my hands. The numbers she'd mentioned during lunch kept cycling through my mind. Salary figures that would dwarf Richard's income, that would make my current dependency not just unnecessary, but laughable. But it wasn't about the money, not really. It was about the choice. For 2 years I'd lived as someone else's appendage, grateful for whatever scraps of dignity they chose to throw my way. I'd become a ghost in my own life, invisible and inconsequential. Now Joan was offering me the chance to become solid again, to matter, to be the kind of woman who took car keys instead of having them taken from her. I picked up the phone and dialed Joan's number. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting. "I don't need until Friday," I said without preamble. "The answer is yes." There was a pause. Then Joan's voice, warm with satisfaction. "Welcome back, Hazel. We have a lot of work to do." After I hung up, I sat in the darkening room and allowed myself to smile. Really smile. For the first time in months. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of reclaiming myself. Tomorrow, I would start being Hazel Delora again, instead of just Richard's mother, Christine's burden. Tomorrow, Christine Slaughter would discover what it felt like when the furniture suddenly developed teeth. But tonight, I would savor the anticipation of watching her world crumble, piece by perfectly deserved piece. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that makes everything seem possible. I woke before dawn, not from restless sleep, but from the electric anticipation that had been coursing through my veins since accepting Joan's offer. For the first time in years, I had somewhere important to be. I dressed with the precision of a general preparing for battle. The charcoal gray suit I'd worn to board meetings, pressed and hanging in the back of my closet like a uniform waiting for deployment. Pearl earrings that had witnessed million-dollar negotiations. The watch Harold had given me for our 20th anniversary. Swiss precision that had counted down more corporate conquests than romantic moments. In the mirror, I saw her again. Hazel Delora, the woman who had never learned to accept no as a final answer. Christine was still unconscious when I left the house, and Richard had already departed for another golf meeting. His life a comfortable rhythm of leisure punctuated by just enough work to maintain his lifestyle. Neither of them had bothered to ask about my plans for the day. Why would they? Old women didn't have plans that mattered. The taxi ride to downtown felt like traveling through time. Buildings I'd once known intimately passed by the window. The marble facade of First National where I'd secured my first major loan. The glass tower where I'd poached my most talented competitor's entire marketing team. The restaurant where I'd closed the deal that transformed Issue and Associates from a promising startup into an industry force. Joan was waiting in the lobby of the Blackstone building, and seeing her in her element was like watching a conductor return to her orchestra. She moved through the space with absolute authority. Security guards nodding respectfully, elevator operators holding doors without being asked. This was her world now, and she wore it like the expensive clothing she'd always favored. "Ready?" she asked as we stepped into the executive elevator. "I've been ready for 5 years," I replied, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "I just forgot for a while." The conference room on the 42nd floor was everything I remembered about corporate power. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a table that could seat 20 but was set for 4, and the kind of ambient lighting that made everyone look like they'd been photoshopped for success. Warren Schmoke, Blackstone's CEO, was younger than I'd expected, perhaps 55, with the kind of confident bearing that came from never having to prove himself to anyone. But when he stood to shake my hand, I recognized something familiar in his eyes, the hunger that drives people to build empires rather than simply inherit them. "Ms. Delora?" he said, his handshake firm without being performative. "I've been looking forward to this meeting for quite some time." "Mr. Schmoke." I settled into the chair across from him, noting how the height was perfectly adjusted to put me at eye level, a small detail that spoke to Joan's preparation. "I understand you have a proposition." What followed was 2 hours of the kind of negotiation that had once been as natural to me as breathing. Warren outlined Blackstone's vision for expansion into the consulting sector, their need for established expertise, and their willingness to pay premium prices for premium talent. The numbers were staggering. Not just the acquisition price for Eshu and Associates, but my compensation package as CEO of the merged entity. But more than the money, it was the respect that made my pulse quicken. These men spoke to me as an equal, sought my opinions on market strategy, deferred to my expertise on client relations. When had I forgotten what it felt like to be valued for my mind, rather than tolerated for my presence? "There is one matter we should discuss," I said as we approached the final details of the agreement. "Current staffing at Eshu and Associates." Joan slid a folder across the table. "We've prepared a comprehensive review of all personnel. Some positions will obviously be redundant after the merger." I opened the folder and found myself looking at Christine's employee file. Her performance reviews were politely devastating. Consistently average ratings disguised by diplomatic language. Meets basic requirements. Shows enthusiasm for learning. Adequate client communication skills. The kind of faint praise that was actually professional damnation. "Christine Slaughter," I said, tasting the name like wine I was considering purchasing. "I see she's up for promotion." Warren glanced at Joan, who maintained the neutral expression she'd perfected during our years working together. "That promotion has been reconsidered. Given the merger, we'll be implementing new performance standards. Ms. Slaughter's current position may not align with our strategic direction." "I see." I closed the folder, my decision crystallizing like water turning to ice. "And what about her current projects?" "Nothing that can't be reassigned," Joan said smoothly. "Her client portfolio is quite manageable." The meeting concluded with handshakes and promises of paperwork to follow. I would officially resume my role as CEO in 1 week, giving Blackstone time to finalize the acquisition and me time to prepare for what would undoubtedly be the most satisfying return in corporate history. As Joan and I descended in the elevator, she studied my reflection in the polished steel doors. "How does it feel?" "Like putting on clothes that actually fit," I said. I'd forgotten what it was like to be myself. "And Christine?" I considered the question, thinking about all the small cruelties, the casual dismissals, the systematic erosion of my dignity that had occurred under her watch. "Christine will learn what it means to be on the other side of someone else's mercy." The taxi ride home passed in a blur of planning. I thought about the upcoming transition, the meetings I would schedule, the strategic decisions that would reshape not just the company, but the lives of everyone connected to it. For the first time in years, my mind was fully engaged, all cylinders firing at maximum capacity. I arrived home to find Richard in the kitchen, making himself a sandwich with the distracted efficiency of someone whose thoughts were elsewhere. "Good lunch?" he asked without looking up. "Very productive," I said, hanging my purse on its hook. "How was golf?" "Fine, fine. Made some good connections." He finally glanced at me, taking in my professional attire with mild surprise. "You're dressed up today." "I had a business meeting." Richard's expression shifted slightly, confusion mixing with the patronizing concern I'd grown to despise. "Business meeting? Mom? You're retired." "What kind of business?" "The kind that used to pay for your college education," I said mildly, pouring myself a glass of water. "The kind that built the life you've been living." Something in my tone must have registered because Richard actually looked at me, really looked, for the first time in months. Is everything okay? Everything is perfect, dear. I smiled, the expression feeling foreign after so long. Absolutely perfect. Christine emerged from her bedroom around 3, still moving carefully but dressed for the office. She'd clearly forced herself to rally, unwilling to appear weak in front of her colleagues. The irony wasn't lost on me. She was fighting off a hangover to return to a job that would soon cease to exist. "I'm heading to the office," she announced, checking her appearance in the hallway mirror. "Joan wants to meet about the restructuring. Probably wants my input on the transition process." "I'm sure she does," I said, watching Christine apply lipstick with the confident strokes of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. "You know, I was thinking," Christine continued, turning to face me with the expression she used when dispensing what she considered wisdom. "Maybe this restructuring is exactly what I need, a chance to show Joan what I'm really capable of. I've been holding back, trying not to intimidate the older staff, but maybe it's time to stop playing small." The audacity of it took my breath away. This woman, who had achieved so little with so many advantages, actually believed she had been restraining herself out of consideration for others. She thought her mediocrity was magnanimity. "I think you should definitely show Joan exactly what you're capable of," I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "Don't hold anything back." Christine smiled, apparently missing the steel beneath my encouragement. "Exactly. Time to stop being modest." She gathered her purse and keys, my keys, and headed for the door. "Don't wait up. This meeting might run late, and then I'll probably grab drinks with the team to celebrate." After she left, I sat in the living room and allowed myself to imagine tomorrow's conversation. Christine, sitting across from Joan's desk, confident and unprepared, waiting to hear about her expanded responsibilities. Joan's professional smile as she delivered the news that there would be no promotion, no expansion, no future at all. And then, perhaps the most delicious moment, the realization that her fate had been decided not by market forces or corporate restructuring, but by the useless old woman whose car keys she'd taken with such casual cruelty. My phone rang, interrupting my reverie. Joan's number appeared on the screen. "How did it go?" I asked. "Better than expected," Joan replied, amusement clear in her voice. "Christine just left my office. She spent 20 minutes explaining how she could help me manage the transition more effectively. She actually suggested I might need someone with fresh perspective to guide me through the challenges ahead. The audacity is almost admirable." "Almost. I scheduled her termination meeting for 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. I thought you might want to be in the building when it happens." I closed my eyes, savoring the anticipation. I wouldn't miss it for the world. "Hazel?" Joan's voice softened slightly. "I hope you know this isn't just about revenge. You belong back in that world. You always did." "I know," I said, and for the first time in years I actually believed it. "But I'll admit, the revenge is a rather nice bonus." After I hung up, I walked to the window and looked out at the street where my car would soon return, driven by a woman who had no idea her life was about to change forever. Tomorrow, Christine Slaughter would discover what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness, age for irrelevance, and temporary power for permanent entitlement. Tomorrow, she would learn that some furniture doesn't just develop teeth, it learns to bite back. I woke at 5:30 on the morning that would change everything, my body humming with an energy I hadn't felt in years. The anticipation was almost physical, a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with the sweet promise of justice finally being served. Christine had returned home after midnight, her heels clicking across the hardwood with the confident rhythm of someone who believed the world was arranging itself in her favor. Through my bedroom wall, I'd heard her on the phone with one of her friends, voice bright with wine and excitement. "Joan was so receptive to my ideas," she'd said, her voice carrying clearly through the thin walls. "I think she finally sees what I bring to the table. Tomorrow's meeting is going to change everything." If only she knew how right she was. I dressed with particular care, the navy blue power suit that had become my signature during the most successful years of my career. paired with the diamond earrings Harold had given me when Eshu and Associates landed its first Fortune 500 client. Every choice was deliberate, calculated to project the authority I was about to reclaim. In the kitchen, I made coffee and toast, moving through the familiar routine while my mind raced ahead to the day's events. Joan had called the night before to confirm the timing, Christine's termination meeting at 10, followed by my official announcement as CEO at noon. By the time the markets closed today, the business world would know that Hazel Delora was back. Richard emerged from his bedroom around 7, already dressed for another day of recreational golf masquerading as business networking. He paused when he saw me, taking in my professional attire with the same confused expression he'd worn yesterday. "Another business meeting?" he asked, pouring himself coffee. "The most important one of my life," I replied, and meant it. Something in my tone made him look at me more carefully. "Mom, what's going on? You've been different lately. I don't know. More like your old self. Perhaps because I'm remembering who my old self was." Before Richard could respond, Christine appeared in the doorway, dressed in her most expensive suit and radiating confidence. She'd clearly spent extra time on her appearance this morning. Hair perfectly styled, makeup flawless, every detail calculated to project success. "Big day today," she announced, checking her reflection in the microwave door. "Joan wants to discuss my role in the restructuring. I have a feeling this conversation is going to be very rewarding." I sipped my coffee, savoring both the rich flavor and the exquisite irony. "I'm sure it will be exactly what you deserve." Christine smiled, apparently hearing only encouragement in my words. "You know, Hazel, I've been thinking. Once I get this promotion, which, let's face it, is basically a done deal, maybe we should look into getting you involved in some senior activities. The community center has bridge games, I think. It might be good for you to get out more, meet people your own age." The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. Even on the morning of her professional execution, she couldn't resist one final blow to what she assumed was my already diminished sense of self-worth. "That's very thoughtful of you, dear," I said, my voice steady despite the fury building in my chest. "I'm sure I'll have plenty of new activities to keep me busy." "Great." Christine gathered her purse and keys, my keys, with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. "Well, I better get going. Don't want to keep Joan waiting when she's about to offer me the promotion of a lifetime." After she left, Richard stared at me with growing concern. "Mom, are you feeling all right? You seem, I don't know, different." "I feel better than I have in years," I said, and it was the absolute truth. I arrived at the Eshu and Associates building at 9:45, taking my time in the lobby to observe the familiar rhythms of corporate life. Employees hurried past with their morning coffee and purpose-driven expressions, most too young to remember when I'd walked these same halls as the woman who'd built this empire from nothing. Joan met me at the elevator, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes bright with anticipation. "She's already here," she said quietly as we ascended to the executive floor. "Arrived 15 minutes early, looking like she owns the place. In 20 minutes she'll discover exactly how little she owns." Joan had arranged for me to wait in her office while she conducted Christine's termination meeting in the conference room down the hall. Through the glass walls, I could see Christine sitting at the large table, checking her phone with the relaxed confidence of someone who believed they were about to receive excellent news. At exactly 10 o'clock, Joan walked into the conference room, carrying a folder that I knew contained the documentation of Christine's professional demise. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could read the body language like a novel written in a language I'd mastered decades ago. Christine's initial bright smile, Joan's professional demeanor as she opened the folder, the moment of confusion as Christine realized this wasn't the conversation she'd expected, the gradual shift from confusion to concern to genuine alarm as Joan methodically explained the situation. I watched Christine's face cycle through the stages of professional grief, denial, anger, bargaining, and finally, a kind of shell-shocked acceptance. Her mouth moved rapidly, no doubt explaining why Joan was making a terrible mistake, listing her contributions and value to the company, promising to work harder if only given another chance. But Joan's expression never changed, never softened. She simply continued speaking, occasionally sliding documents across the table for Christine to sign. Termination papers, non-disclosure agreements, the bureaucratic detritus of a career that had ended not with triumph, but with the quiet efficiency of corporate housekeeping. The meeting lasted exactly 23 minutes. When it was over, Christine sat alone at the conference table for several minutes, staring at the papers in front of her as if they might transform into something more palatable if she looked at them long enough. Finally, she gathered her purse and walked toward the elevator with the mechanical movements of someone in shock. Her confident stride had been replaced by the uncertain steps of someone who no longer knew where she belonged. "It's done," Joan said, returning to her office. She took it about as well as expected. Lots of protests about how valuable she is, how this must be some kind of mistake. She actually asked if there was someone higher up she could appeal to. And what did you tell her? That there was indeed someone higher up, and that this decision came directly from the top. At noon, Joan and I walked together into the main conference room where the senior staff had gathered for what they'd been told was an important announcement about the company's future. I recognized most of the faces, people I'd hired, trained, and mentored before my retirement. Their expressions ranged from curious to concerned, unsure what to expect from this mysterious meeting. Joan stepped to the front of the room, her voice carrying the authority that had made her such an effective second-in-command. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to announce that Blackstone Industries has completed its acquisition of Eshu and Associates. As part of this transition, I'm even more pleased to introduce our new CEO, someone many of you know and all of you should respect. Please welcome back Hazel DeLaura." The reaction was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Applause filled the room, accompanied by genuine smiles and expressions of delight. These people remembered what I'd built, what I'd accomplished, what I represented in terms of both success and integrity. I stepped forward, feeling the familiar rush of commanding a room full of intelligent, capable people who were prepared to follow my lead. "Thank you. It's good to be home." The rest of the meeting was a masterclass in corporate communication, outlining the transition plan, addressing concerns about job security, and establishing the new strategic direction under Blackstone's ownership. But throughout it all, I couldn't help thinking about Christine, probably sitting in her car in the parking garage, trying to process how completely her world had shifted in the space of a single morning. As the meeting concluded and people began to disperse, Robert Rice, our head of client relations, approached me with a grin. "Hazel, I have to ask, did you know this was coming when you retired? Because the timing is absolutely perfect. We've missed your leadership more than you know." "Sometimes the best strategies require patience," I replied. "Sometimes you have to let people reveal who they really are before you can address the situation appropriately." By 3 o'clock, news of my return had spread throughout the industry. My new assistant, since I would obviously need one, fielded calls from reporters, competitors, and former clients who wanted to congratulate me on what the business press was already calling the most dramatic corporate comeback of the decade. But the call I was waiting for came at 4:15. Christine's number appeared on my phone, and I let it ring 3 times before answering. "Hazel?" Her voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it, stripped of its usual condescension and confidence. Are you really the new CEO of Eshu and Associates?" "I am indeed," I said, my voice carrying the calm authority of someone who no longer needed to pretend to be less than she was. "Is there something I can help you with, Christine?" There was a long pause, filled with the sound of someone trying to find words for a situation they'd never imagined possible. "I don't understand. How is this? When did you? I thought you were just a retired old woman." "The mistake," I said gently, "was assuming that retirement meant irrelevance, that age meant obsolescence, that being quiet meant being powerless." Another pause. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "What happens now?" I looked out the window of my new office. My old office, really, restored to me like a kingdom I'd temporarily abdicated. "Now, Christine, you discover what life looks like when you're no longer protected by someone else's kindness, when your actions have consequences, when the furniture you've been treating as decoration turns out to have teeth." I hung up before she could respond, then turned to Joan, who who had been watching from the doorway with undisguised admiration. "Feel better?" she asked. "Much," I said, though I suspect the best is yet to come. Outside, the business district hummed with its usual energy, but I was no longer watching from the sidelines. I was back where I belonged, and the woman who had called me a useless old woman was about to discover just how useful this old woman could be when properly motivated. The reckoning was only beginning. 3 weeks had passed since Christine's world collapsed, and I was settling into my restored kingdom with the satisfaction of a queen who had reclaimed her throne through wit rather than warfare. The corner office felt like an old coat that had been hanging in the closet, familiar, comfortable, and perfectly tailored to who I really was. The morning light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows as I reviewed the quarterly projections that painted a picture of unprecedented growth. Under Blackstone's resources and my strategic direction, Eshu and Associates was expanding faster than even my most optimistic projections had anticipated. 3 new Fortune 500 clients had signed on in the past 2 weeks alone, drawn by the reputation I'd spent decades building and had now reclaimed. My assistant, Nita Kelly, a sharp woman in her 40s who reminded me of Joan 20 years earlier, knocked and entered with my morning briefing. "The Wall Street Journal wants to schedule a follow-up interview about your return," she said, setting the day's priorities on my desk with military precision. "And Warren Schmoke's office called to confirm lunch on Friday." "Schedule the Journal for next week," I said, signing off on a contract that would bring in more revenue than Christine had generated in her entire tenure. "And confirm with Warren. I have some expansion ideas he'll find interesting." Through my window, I could see the parking garage where Christine had once sat in my car, processing the reality of her termination. The image still brought me satisfaction, though it was no longer the sharp pleasure of fresh revenge. Now it was simply the settled contentment of justice served and balance restored. My phone buzzed with a text from Joan, who had been promoted to Chief Operating Officer as part of the merger. "Lunch today? I have news." We met at the same restaurant where she'd first proposed my return, a choice that felt appropriately cyclical. Joan arrived looking energized in a way that suggested good news, and I found myself curious about what development had put that particular spark in her eyes. "Christine's been calling around the industry," Joan said after we'd ordered, "trying to find another position. Apparently, she's discovered that when your former CEO personally ensures that accurate references are provided, finding new employment becomes challenging." I sipped my wine, considering this information. "I assume these references are entirely factual. Meticulously so. Her attendance record, her client retention rates, her contribution to revenue growth, all documented with the kind of precision that makes lies unnecessary." Joan's smile was sharp enough to cut crystal. "The truth, it turns out, is the most devastating weapon of all. And Richard? How is he handling his wife's career transition?" Joan's expression grew more serious. "That's actually what I wanted to discuss with you. He came to see me yesterday. Apparently, the financial pressure is becoming significant. Christine's unemployment benefits won't cover their lifestyle, and his golf-focused networking isn't generating the income they need." I set down my wine glass, studying Joan's face. "I assume he had a specific request. He wants to know if there might be a position for Christine in the new organization. Something entry-level," he said. "He's willing to vouch for her character and work ethic." The irony was so perfect it almost hurt. My son, who had allowed his wife to treat me as an inconvenient burden, was now asking me to rescue that same wife from the consequences of her own actions. The woman who had called me useless was now dependent on my usefulness. "What did you tell him?" "That all hiring decisions go through you now. That if he wanted to make a case for his wife's employment, he should speak to his mother." That evening, I returned to what was no longer Richard and Christine's house, but my house, purchased with the substantial signing bonus Blackstone had provided and restored to my name within a week of my return to power. The mortgage had been paid off with the kind of casual efficiency that money makes possible when you have enough of it. I had moved back into the master bedroom, reclaimed my rightful place at the head of the dinner table, and restored my photographs to their prominent positions throughout the house. Christine's modern art had been packed away, along with most evidence of her brief reign over my domestic life. Richard was waiting in the living room when I arrived. looking more uncomfortable than I'd seen him since his father's funeral. His usual confidence had been replaced by the awkward uncertainty of someone who suddenly realized they'd misjudged a fundamental power dynamic. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, standing as I entered the room. "Of course." I settled into my chair, Harold's old chair, which had somehow become Christine's during my exile and was now mine again. "What's on your mind?" Richard began pacing, a nervous habit he'd developed as a child when he knew he was in trouble. "This situation with Christine's job. I know you're probably angry about how she treated you, but she's my wife. She's struggling. I've never seen her this lost." "I see." I folded my hands in my lap, projecting the calm patience of someone who held all the cards and knew it. "And you think I should do something about that?" "I think you could, if you wanted to." Richard stopped pacing and faced me directly. "Joan told me all hiring goes through you now. You have the power to help Christine, to give her another chance." "I do indeed have that power." I let the words hang in the air between us, watching him process the implications. "The question is, why should I use it?" Richard's face cycled through several expressions: frustration, confusion, and finally a dawning realization that this conversation wasn't going to proceed according to the script he'd prepared. "Because she's family," he said finally. "Because you're better than this. Because holding grudges isn't who you are. Isn't it?" I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the garden I'd restored to my preferred design. "Tell me, Richard, during the 2 years I lived here as your dependent, how many times did you intervene when Christine treated me with disrespect? How many times did you ask her to modify her behavior toward your mother? Mom, how many times did you suggest that perhaps my needs mattered as much as hers? That my comfort in my own home should be considered? That a woman who built a successful business from nothing might have something valuable to contribute?" Richard was silent, and in that silence, I heard the answer we both knew. "The truth is," I continued, "you found it convenient to have Christine manage the unpleasant business of making me feel unwelcome. It allowed you to maintain the fiction that you were a good son, while ensuring I knew my place in the hierarchy of your household. That's not— I didn't mean for it to be like that. What you meant is irrelevant. What matters is what you allowed to happen." I turned to face him, and for the first time in years, I saw my son really look at me, not as an aging obligation, but as a woman who commanded respect. "Christine called me a useless old woman while taking my car keys. She suggested I find activities with people my own age while sitting in my kitchen, eating food I'd prepared. She treated me like an inconvenient piece of furniture that needed to be managed and contained." Richard's face had gone pale. "I didn't know she said those things." "You didn't know because you didn't want to know. Because knowing would have required you to choose between your wife's comfort and your mother's dignity." I returned to my chair, settling back into its familiar embrace. "Well, now I've made that choice for you. So you won't help her?" I considered the question, thinking about the woman who had once commanded boardrooms and built empires, and the woman who had been reduced to watching her possessions drive away in someone else's hands. "I will offer Christine exactly the same consideration she offered me. None." "Mom, please, she's learned her lesson. She knows she made mistakes." "Has she?" I reached for the folder I'd prepared for this conversation, sliding it across the coffee table toward Richard. "These are the references she's been providing to potential employers. Read the section about her accomplishments at Eshu and Associates." Richard opened the folder and read in silence, his expression growing more troubled with each line. Christine had been presenting herself as a key contributor to major client acquisitions she'd had nothing to do with, claiming credit for strategic initiatives she'd never been involved in, and describing herself as an indispensable member of the senior leadership team. "She's lying," he said finally, "consistently and creatively. Even in unemployment, she can't resist rewriting history to cast herself as the victim of circumstances, rather than the author of her own downfall." I retrieved the folder and closed it with finality. "That is not someone who has learned lessons. That is someone who believes she's entitled to a redemption she hasn't earned." Richard slumped into the opposite chair, looking older than his 43 years. "What am I supposed to do? I love her, but I can't support both of us on what I make. And she can't find work anywhere in the industry. You could suggest she consider a career change. Retail, perhaps. Food service. Something where her previous professional reputation won't precede her. You know she'd never accept that. Then she'll discover what pride costs when you can't afford it. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of changed circumstances settling between us like furniture being rearranged in a room. Finally, Richard spoke again, his voice smaller than I'd heard it since he was a child. "I'm sorry, Mom, for how I let you be treated, for making you feel unwelcome in your own life. I don't know how to fix that." I studied my son's face, seeing genuine remorse for perhaps the first time. "The damage between us can be repaired, Richard, but it will require you to understand that I am not a problem to be managed or an obligation to be endured. I am your mother, and I have earned better than the treatment I received." "And Christine?" I smiled, feeling the satisfaction of a lesson perfectly delivered. "Christine will discover that actions have consequences, that cruelty leaves marks, and that the old woman she dismissed as useless is, in fact, the most useful person she'll never work for again." As Richard left that evening, I remained in my restored living room, surrounded by my reclaimed possessions and my rebuilt life. Through the window, I could see the lights of the city where I once again commanded respect, where my name meant something beyond obligation and burden. Tomorrow, I would continue building the empire I'd reclaimed. I would make decisions that affected hundreds of lives, negotiate deals worth millions of dollars, and shape the future of an industry I'd helped create. But tonight, I would simply sit in my own chair, in my own house as myself, Hazel Delora, the woman who had learned that sometimes the sweetest victory comes not from climbing to the top, but from remembering you'd been there all along. The useless old woman had become indispensable once again. And some lessons, I reflected with deep satisfaction, were worth waiting 73 years to teach.